Testing. Hello. Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started with Pastor's Bible study here in about 5 minutes, but I did want to say welcome to each of you to this windy Wednesday, isn't it? Yes. Our pastor will lead us here in a bit. Hey, Dr. Wiles, he's over there greeting our girls. Love it. A few things for y'all. One, thank you very much for praying for our babies and caring for us. I wanted to give you a small update. Y'all know our triplet boys. They're all here at the CDC every day, but we've actually made it a full week of all three of them coming because they were sick for like a month. So yeah, you can clap for that. But even bigger news, last night, for the first time, all three boys slept through the whole night. It's a big deal. Yeah. So we're pretty excited. We don't know that it'll happen every time, but we're pretty proud of them. So you can pray for us. They slept from like 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. I mean, a big night. So Ryan and I are full of hope today. And I was telling Vaughn, hope is a powerful tool. Hope, God uses that. So we're very excited. But
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Pastor's Bible Study today. Glad you all can make it, and we're glad to have you here in this room. Want to welcome those of you that are joining us online today, and thank you for being a part of this. And for those of you that are online, y'all just missed the big news that Katie's triplets slept all night last night, so that's just huge news. And we're excited for them. And the good news is, as kids get older, they never keep you up at night. True? I mean, she's not listening, so we won't tell her that, okay? So, 17, 18, 19, you can just quit worrying about them, right? So, all right. Well, today we are going to look at Genesis 14. But what we'll have to do, because of kind of an unusual little insertion in that story, we're going to have to spend a good bit of time in the New Testament today because of what happens in this particular story. So, if you look at your outline, I kept a couple of things on there because I just want to keep them in front of us. When we're studying the life of Abraham in particular, really is the beginning of what theologians refer to as redemptive history. This is God's answer to what took place in the Garden of Eden in the fall of humanity. And also, I just reminded you that we do refer to this man as Father Abraham and his incredible impact in the lives of folks from three major world religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And his story is found in the Bible, Genesis 11:27 through 25:11. So I just left that in there for you also. Just a reminder that this is a theological journey. It's written from a spiritual perspective. At the heart of the story is the stewarding of this promise. And the promise of the heir of Abraham is more than just Abraham's heir, which eventually, of course, will be Isaac. It's really the story of the promise given to the people of God. And that is that through Abraham, all the peoples of the world are going to be blessed, all the families through his family. And so it's a theological and spiritual story. It's not just a recounting of world history, although it does have that feel to it. So with that said, I want us to look at Genesis 14 today. And I would just generally refer to it as the rescue of Lot. And it's somewhat of a fascinating story, so if you look at it with me, we'll start in verse 1. And basically, we just have a listing of, I can remember when I was younger at our church, what we would do is, when we came to one of these names, we would just say hard name because nobody knew how to pronounce it. So, at the time when hard name was king of hard name, king of hard name, king of hard name. So there's this whole list of strangely named people, okay? And they're all connected to that part of the world. Now, when you go back and try to connect all this to world history, we have numerous challenges. We have, for example, we have listings. If you look at verse 1, you see Kedor Laomer, listed as the king of Elam. Well, we actually have some records of kings of Elam. His name is not mentioned. One of the problems that we have with that, some scholars look at that and say, well, this must be a fictional account. It's interesting to me how quickly people will try to make those kinds of assumptions when there's no way for us to know that we have a complete listing of any of these kings in antiquity. So in other words, how trustworthy are the sources that we find that are extra biblical? Does that make sense? And so we don't really have a complete listing of all of this. Here's what we do have, though. When you read some of these geographical locations that are mentioned in this story, we do have records of those in this particular era, okay? And so there are some there's some geographical connections. But basically what's going to happen in this story is kind of for the first time, really, this story grounds the patriarchal narrative in history. Because we've been listening to kind of this big account, if you will, of the life of the people of God prior to Abraham, or the people of the world really prior to Abraham. And now we get to Abraham's story, and we're in the age of the patriarchs. And now for the first time, we're going to ground that story in history. So we've got details of geography. We've got this story of these various kings and the regions of that part of the world that they were in charge of. And it's done with pretty precise detail. And so I think that adds some credibility to this story, if you will. But here's what's going on in Genesis 14, as I put in your outline. You've got these rival kings, and basically they're battling for the kinds of things kings always battle over. And that is land, slaves, possessions, power. And so you have this group of kings from the east that is ruling over this group of kings from the west. The kings in the west rebel. The kings in the east march on the kings in the west. And they win. Well, how it connects to us, if you look at verse 8, the connection to us and our story and where we are in Genesis, the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah are in this story. And so that helps you understand that these men were what some people would probably refer to as chieftains. Maybe the word king is a little misleading, because these people lived in what you might refer to as city-states. So in other words, Sodom was an actual city. So if you talked about this man being the king of Sodom, maybe the chieftain, if you will, of that particular city. Walled, protected, and then Gomorrah had its own chieftain or king, protected, if you will. And so these two kings in particular are a part of the group that loses. Okay? So they're overrun by these kings from the east. And if you look at verse 10, Moses gives us some interesting little detail. Around the Dead Sea at that time, there were these tar pits, and some of these folks actually fell into these tar pits, but some of them actually hid in these tar pits so they wouldn't be discovered. And so the way the Hebrew is worded there, you have a little bit of that going on. And so Sodom and Gomorrah's chieftains, kings have run. Some of them are hiding out in tar pits. However, if you look at verse 12, here's the verse that is going to spring Abram into action. Lot was carried away along with his possessions. Because you remember, Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom. You remember that? When Abram and Lot separated. So Lot's taken prisoner in the melee. So, in other words, these eastern kings, they take what they want. The rest of the kings and their armies flee. These folks load up all the stuff that they've taken from these various cities. And evidently they're hauling some people off with them. And one of the folks they take with them is Lot. So if you look at verse 13, here's the story of how Abraham rescued Lot. Verse 13, it says, a man who escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now that's an interesting phrase. First time it appears in the text. And Abram is not usually referred to that way. Of course, he'll eventually be known as Abraham. But the Hebrew, well, that's because he is a descendant of Eber. Remember, we've talked about this already, E-B-E-R. And we believe that's where the word Hebrew comes from. It's an ethnic term that will describe the descendants of Abraham. It's a little confusing, those of you that do a whole lot of detail work in the book of Genesis and Exodus, because there's a whole nother group of people called the Habiru, H-A-B-I-R-U. So when you're studying Old Testament history, you'll run across that group of folks. And some people have tried to identify the Habiru with the Hebrews. The problem with that is the Habiru people were settled already in the land of Canaan. And they are not necessarily, I believe, connected really to the Hebrew people. I think they're two distinct groups of people. But that word Hebrew, it comes from the Hebrew name Eber, like most of these names do. They come from someone named in one of these genealogical tables. And so Abraham is a descendant of that particular family. Now remember when Lot and Abram separated, Abram goes to the southwestern part of Canaan. And he settles there by the oak of Mamre. And that's mentioned here in verse 13. That's where he's living. This is the only time, I think, in the scripture where Mamre is listed as a person's name, not just an area. But anyway, that's where Abram was. And if you look at verse 14, when Abram heard his relative had been taken captive, he had a group of, this lets you know how wealthy Abram was at this time. He had 318 trained men born in his household. So by this time, Abram has become a very wealthy person. Lots of possessions, herds, and he has a lot of folks who are living under his charge. And the Hebrew word that's translated there, trained men, this is the only time it appears in the Old Testament. We're a little bit unsure of what it might mean, but I think we'll just take it as the NIV translates it. These were trained soldiers. So Abram decides he is going to intervene. And so, if you look at verse 15, during the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them. So Abram demonstrated some military acumen. I think it's the one time we find him in the scripture referred to as this military warrior. But he basically surrounds these folks, and he attacks them at night. And he divides his people, so the idea is it feels like there are more of them than there are, if that makes sense. And so they overrun these folks who had conquered the kings from the west, and he actually is able to rescue, verse 16, Lot and all of his possessions. So it's a very fascinating story. When you look at Genesis 14, you read Genesis 12 through 22, and if I think I'm right about this, God speaks on every page except this one. So 14 is the only one where we don't really get a direct word from God or some kind of vision from God. But we have a very fascinating story about Abraham's connection to Lot. Now, perhaps some of you who were disappointed in Abraham lying about Sarah last week, this will help redeem him a little bit, that he did go and rescue his nephew at least and brought him back safely. So he's on his way home, and he's going to end up meeting with the king of Sodom. And the king of Sodom is going to want to bless him. He's going to thank him for what he's done. And so if you look at verse 21, the king of Sodom says to Abraham, he says, look, thank you for rescuing my people, bringing these folks back, and all their possessions, everything you've recovered. And he says, you can just keep everything you've recovered if you'll just give me my people. And, well, Abram says back to him, he says, I'm not going to take anything from you. Look at verse 23. I will not accept anything from you. And there was a little saying in that part of the world at the time, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal. We have that little phrase written in multiple places. And so Abraham is using the common vernacular basically to say, I'm not taking anything from you. I don't want anybody saying, well, the only reason Abraham is successful is because the king of Sodom has blessed him. He said, I don't need you. And so you can have all your stuff back. He said, the only thing I'm going to do is make sure my men who made their way to this rescue, I just want to make sure they get what's coming to them, and then everything else you can keep. And so that's basically what he did. Okay? So it's a fascinating story. Sometimes when scholars are reading these stories, they try to figure out why is this story even in here. I guess we could spend some time on that. That feels a little wasteful to me because it is in here, and we don't have any manuscript without it. So I think it connects us, it grounds us in history, it shows us the side of Abraham that I think is important, helps us watch this man continuing to grow in his faith and his journey with God, because that's what this is about, his own journey of faith. And he's a noble person, and we're seeing him grow in righteousness, okay? Now, with all that said, you have a very interesting little insertion in this story that has incredible ramifications that will take you by surprise, okay? So if you'll look with me at verse 17, after Abraham returned from defeating this hard-named king, he's on his way home. Look at verse 18. Then, in Hebrew, you'd say Melchizedek. I grew up in Alabama, so we say Melchizedek. Okay, so however you want to pronounce it. King of Salem. Okay, he brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of El Elyon in Hebrew, God of the Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, El Elyon." Well, who is El Elyon? Well, he is the creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to El Elyon, the creator of heaven and earth, who's delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Now, what an interesting little insertion into this warrior story. Okay? So, Melchizedek will be mentioned again in Psalm 110. Okay? And so let me just read to you real quickly. The reason Psalm 110 is important is because Psalm 110 is a psalm of David, and it will be interpreted by the New Testament writers as a messianic psalm. And it will be connected to the promise that God gave David in 2 Samuel 7 that he was going to be, that his seed would rule over the people of God forever. And so we'll find this particular psalm in the imagination of the New Testament theologians, writers, as they think about the Messiah. But in Psalm 110, verse 4, the text says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever," talking about the seed of David in the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110, verse 4. So we have this interesting little insertion about this king priest from Salem intersecting Abram on his way home. And now Melchizedek gets written into the messianic script. Fascinating, isn't it? So who is Melchizedek? Well, we would say he was a king. He's the king of Salem. Most scholars would agree that's a reference to Jerusalem. The reason we say that is because of Psalm 76, verse 1. Let me read that to you. It says, "God is renowned in Judah. In Israel his name is great. His tent is in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion." Well, where was God's tent? Jerusalem. And yet it's referred to in this text as in Salem. Jeru-Salem. Okay? So we believe he's the king from Jerusalem. Here's what's fascinating about Melchizedek. We know nothing about him, and he's mentioned when he enters into this story that he is a priest of El Elyon. He is priest of the Most High God, the creator of heaven and earth. And notice what he tells Abraham. He says, "Abraham, you didn't win this battle." Make sure you know that. Notice what he says. Look at verse 20. "God delivered your enemies into your hand." Now, that doesn't mean that Abraham didn't go and fight. Doesn't mean he didn't organize. It doesn't mean he didn't do all his due diligence. But what Melchizedek wants him to know from a priestly perspective, God had his hand on you, protected you, and delivered these enemies into your hand. And then he blesses Abraham, or Abram. So typically, in the Old Testament understanding of that, the superior blesses the inferior. Does that make sense? It's fascinating how that's done. That's even going to be in this book later, because the Bible is going to tell us that at the end of Jacob's life, this herdsman, this shepherd from Canaan, is going to bless Pharaoh. Now, how can a herdsman, a shepherd, who literally has no home anymore, bless the wealthiest man on the planet? Well, it just tells you God's view of Jacob in comparison to Pharaoh. The superior blesses the inferior. And so I want y'all to think about that for just a second, because we're not talking about John Doe here. We're talking about Abraham. And I don't know how many people y'all want to line up that are superior to Abraham. In my opinion, that's going to be a very short line. You know, y'all remember that time they asked old Bud Phillips if, what was his running back's name? Do y'all remember? From Texas, Earl Campbell. Is Earl Campbell in a class by himself? And Bud said, well, I don't know, but I know it doesn't take long to call roll in that class. So, one time Earl Campbell showed up at camp and couldn't run a mile. He stopped before he finished, and they asked Phillips about it. Does that bother you? He said, well, if it's ever third down in a mile, we won't run him. Well, anyway, I would just say this about Abraham. If you're going to try to line up everybody that's ever lived that's greater than Abraham, it just won't take long to call roll in that room. But in this story, guess who's in that room? Melchizedek. It's the superior's blessing the inferior. And then not just that, y'all. Notice how he's recognized by Abram. Look what Abram does in response to hearing this message, to receiving this blessing, and getting this theological interpretation of his victory. Notice what he does. Abraham gave him a tithe of everything. And so this king, then, this priest, presumably returns to Jerusalem, and Abram goes on his way. Now, you could read that story and just walk right past it, but the problem is, y'all, not problem, but the interesting thing about that is, this story is going to get woven into the psyche of Israel's understanding of what God did through the life of Abram. And so, David is going to mention him in the Psalms, this priest, forever. Because we don't hear anything about Melchizedek's death. He just disappears. That doesn't mean he didn't die, it just means it's not mentioned. Then, there's going to be, by the time Jesus arrives on planet Earth, the Jews in Israel are going to be segmented into various groupings, okay? And they're going to be different leaders with different perspectives trying to help Israel learn how to live in the Roman Empire. So you're going to have the Sadducees, and the Sadducees are all descendants of Levi. They're the priests. And the Sadducees made peace with the Romans. So the Sadducees, they only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, and they basically believed that Israel needed to live in peace with whoever was ruling over them and make the best of it. So consequently, people like Caiaphas would be in a relationship with Pontius Pilate. That wouldn't surprise you because these men were co-rulers. The Pharisees believed that having the relationship with the Romans was causing pollution theologically and spiritually in the life of Israel. So they taught more of a separation philosophy with regard to the Romans. And they were a little stricter in their understanding of the teaching of the Old Testament. They were a little more progressive, though, in the sense that they took the full teachings of the Old Testament, angels, resurrection from the dead, life after death, things that are implied or taught specifically in the rest of the Old Testament, the prophecy material, the narrative material. Pharisees embraced all that. The Zealots said, here's what we need to do. We need to mobilize ourselves and we need to overrun the Romans like our forebears have done in the past. The Maccabees revolted and won, even though it was for a season. The Zealots said, we need to arm ourselves and we need to run the Romans out of Israel. We actually have one disciple who came from that crowd, remember? Simon the Zealot. Simon was in that group, okay? Then you had another group who said, we just can't have anything to do with any of these people because all they're going to do is pollute us. And so they not only separated in terms of their philosophy, their theology, they separated physically. And they went and built themselves a community out by the Dead Sea. And they were known as the Qumran community. And the Qumran community were known by the people who lived there. They were the Essenes. And the Essenes said, the Pharisees are wrong. The Sadducees are wrong. The Romans are pagans. It's foolhardy to try to overrun them physically like the Zealots. We just got to trust God to take care of us. In that community, the Essenes began to write material theologically that captured what many of the Jews believed at the time. And when you read the material that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, guess who they write about to some degree? Melchizedek. They talk about how Melchizedek is this hero, that he's this incredible king priest. And so, in the Jewish mind, by the time you get to the first century, there was great expectation for the Messiah, and somehow Melchizedek has been written into the script primarily because of the fact that Abraham was viewed as an inferior to him, and Abraham tithed to him, and he's mentioned in Psalm 110 as someone who's connected to the seed of David who's supposed to rule over them. So now there's a thread of Melchizedek woven into the messianic mosaic. Are y'all still with me? All of that comes from these 2 or 3 verses right here of Abraham encountering this guy on his way home, receiving a theological interpretation of what's just happened, acknowledging him as a priest of the same God that Abraham is going to worship and worships already, and giving him a tithe. Okay? So, with all of that said, it's somewhat mysterious, but with all that said, I want us to look at Melchizedek in the New Testament. And it shouldn't surprise us where he shows up. He shows up in the most Jewish book in the New Testament. And that's the book of Hebrews. Okay? So just look with me at Hebrews, okay? Because we need to do this to connect all this. Hebrews, here's what the writer of Hebrews is basically trying to accomplish. Best we can tell. We believe the writer of Hebrews is writing his letter to the church in Rome. And he's predominantly addressing the Jewish Christians in the church at Rome. Church at Rome had both Jews and Gentiles. And there'd been some persecution already. You remember when Claudius kicked all the Jews out, he got so confused with what was going on with all these Jews and Christians. But eventually they'll be able to return. And one of the temptations that the Jewish Christians would face is this. In the Roman Empire, Judaism was tolerated, and eventually Christianity is going to be persecuted. And so the temptation of Jewish Christians is going to be to return to Judaism. So when the Romans actually went to Jerusalem in AD 66 through 70 and destroyed Jerusalem, they didn't do that because of a theological conversation. They did that because of the constant rebellion of the Jews in the Holy Land. And so they conquered them militarily, but they still allowed them to have some freedom, whereas Christianity is going to be persecuted. So the writer of Hebrews basically is saying this to all Jewish Christians. If you look at the new covenant that we now have in Jesus, it is superior to the old covenant that we had in Moses. So if you're tempted to go back to your life before Jesus, then you're returning to something that's inferior, that as a matter of fact is no longer in effect. Okay? Basically the argument of the writer of Hebrews is saying God's people today are the new covenantal people of God, Jew and Gentile. That's the core argument. And so he's going to say things like Moses was a servant, Jesus is the son. There's a difference between a servant and a son. But when you get to this conversation, he's going to present the argument that Jesus is our new priest. Here's one of the challenges the Hebrews would have with that is Jesus was not a Levite. What was Jesus? What tribe was Jesus from? Judah. The tribe of Judah did not produce priests. Okay? The Levites produced the priests. Remember, the high priest in Jerusalem was Caiaphas. He was a Levite. So they're descendants of Aaron. Okay? Jesus is a descendant of Judah. So the question is, how can a descendant of Judah now take the place of all of our high priests? How can the new covenant now be initiated through a priest that doesn't even come from the priestly line? That's kind of the core question for some Jewish Christians, and certainly Jews who weren't Christians, okay? So when you're reading Hebrews, that's kind of in the backdrop of the book of Hebrews. So let me just walk you through what happens in the book of Hebrews with regard to Jesus. And here's what's fascinating. The writer decides to connect Jesus to guess who? Melchizedek, of all people. Okay? So he starts it in chapter 5, verse 6. He says, "You're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." That's the quote from Psalm 110. This man who wrote Hebrews, we don't know who wrote Hebrews, but he knew that the Jewish leaders in that day believed Psalm 110 was a messianic psalm, and they believed that verse right there referred to the Messiah. And so he's using it right off the bat. So here's what I'm going to tell you about the Son of God. He is the fulfillment of this very promise. He's from the line of David, and he is our king and our priest. So here's basically what he does. He says Melchizedek actually prefigures Christ as high priest. So it's a theological interpretation of who Melchizedek was. So the argument begins really in chapter 6, verse 20. Our forerunner has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever, not in the order of Levi, not in the order of Aaron, but notice, he has become our high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is the prefiguring of Christ. Then you start chapter 7, and he just shows you, here's why we believe this theologically. And so he says, Melchizedek was the king of Salem. He was the priest of the God Most High. This is Hebrews 7, okay, if you need to find it there. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings, and he blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. The name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. That's what the name means. And he was also the king of Salem, which is the king of peace. Notice verse 3. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever, at least in the literature. And look how great he was. I love this verse 4. There's a little word in Hebrew, in Greek, it's used several times in the New Testament. The best way to translate it is just think. Just think. He uses that word here. Just think. Think about how great he was. Remember, line up everybody greater than Abraham and put them in a room. Not many people get invited in that room. Melchizedek gets invited. Just think. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. And then he tells this whole story about the Levites and how they become priests. And he says, however, guess what? This man, verse 6, he didn't trace his descent from Levi. He collected a tenth from Abraham, and he blessed him who had the promises. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. So that means Melchizedek was greater. In the one case, the tenth is collected by people who die. That's Levi. But in the other case, by him who's declared to be living. One might even say that Levi, who now collects the tenth, that's the priest, paid the tenth through Abraham, because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. So Levi hasn't been born yet. He's a descendant of Abraham. And the writer of Hebrews says, if you want to think about it this way, Levi was actually in the loins of Abraham, and so Levi even paid a tenth to this priest. So this priest is better than Levi. Okay, so here's the argument. This man Melchizedek received a tithe from Father Abraham, not just from anybody. I'm talking Father Abraham. Levi is inferior to Melchizedek. As a matter of fact, this writer says the superior is receiving this from the inferior, so I would even argue Levi paid a tithe to Melchizedek. Okay? Then you come to verse 11 of chapter 7, and here's what he basically argues. The Aaronic priesthood, in other words, the descendants of Aaron, it was necessary but imperfect. These priests were all imperfect people. They've all died. They represented the old covenant. Melchizedek is different than they are. And notice verse 15, Hebrews 7. And what we've said is even more clear. If another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who's become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. Melchizedek wasn't priest because he was a child of Levi. He was a priest for some mysterious, unknown reason. And now he's arguing, well, Jesus is a priest because of the indestructible life. So it repeats again, Psalm 110. You're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And then he says, now, this whole new priesthood is going to emerge from, of all people, Judah, not Levi. And because of that, he says, look at verse 22, because of that, Jesus has become the guarantor of a new covenant. So the new high priest, Jesus, who's a descendant of Judah, has now established a new covenant, and it is superior to the old covenant. And then he tells us in verse 23, there have been many of these priests, many of these Levites. Death prevented them from continuing in office, but Jesus lives forever. He has a permanent priesthood, so Jesus is the permanent high priest. And then you get to verse 26, and he says, in fact, nobody's like him. He's holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners. He's exalted above the heavens. He's superior to all other priests. So we have this interesting little insertion of this connection between Abram and this priest king of Salem, and he theologically interprets what's happened to Abram. Abram then blesses, it receives his blessing. Abram returns, gives a tithe, and then Melchizedek now gets written into the Messianic script. And Jesus now in the book of Hebrews is compared to Melchizedek, and the argument is this priesthood is older than Levi. It's not dependent upon descendancy from Levi. And this priest was the priest of peace. He's connected to the holy city, Jerusalem. And if you think about it, that's really who Jesus is. And Jesus is more akin to this priest than the faulty priests who've come from Levi, even though they were necessary at the time. They were inferior because they ministered an inferior covenant that was necessary. A new covenant has been established. Jesus has established it. He is the priest, the high priest, the permanent high priest, who will be our priest and intercede for us forever. So, fascinating theological interpretation of what appears to be a random event in Abram's life. So, all right, I'm going to stop right there. So, online folks, thank you for joining us. I'll stop and...